Just be safe, behave, be brave, and I swear it's going to be the best summer ever, okay? Marshmallow was directed by Daniel Del Purgatorio in his feature film debut and was written by Andy Krakowiak, who did Black Friday, a film I heard a lot about, so I really need to check it out at some point, and takes place at Camp Almar in Carrollton, Kentucky, not Carrollton, Georgia. Oh, if I only had time. Deep cut wrestling fans will get that. Everybody else will be mind-numbingly confused. This actually is Camp Kyrok. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And yeah, it takes place over a few days at a summer camp where a 12-year-old boy named Morgan, played by Hugh Lawrence, not to be confused with Hugh Lawrence, not Hugh Beaumont, none of that stuff. He is basically just trying to fit in. He does find some kids that he gets along with, even a girl that may turn into something, a little bit of a romance. Woo! There's going to be no ordinary time at summer camp because there's a campfire tale about something that occurred on that land, but that campfire tale is anything other than just a tale. When things start to come up and it starts to come true, oh boy, your time at Camp Almar may turn a bit blue. Aha, aha. So, it does start a bit slow. We do get a little bit of information sprinkled throughout, including a bit about Morgan with his family before he goes to summer camp. He also suffers from nightmares, a lot of nightmares. In fact, I was actually kind of impressed with how they did the nightmare sequences. And these all tie into something that is revealed later on. But there's also a bully named CJ, and there's, there's the typical camp counselors. There's the big buff dude named Casimir. There's one named Rachel, played by Georgia Wiggum, who was in Dashcam. Fortunately, not that Dashcam, the good Dashcam, or at least the better Dashcam than that found footage bullshit. If you know, you know. And even though it takes its time revealing what eventually goes on, it does end up basically kicking it into gear right around the halfway point. And I will say this much. I didn't know what to expect with this movie when I clicked on it. It was available for, I don't know, $6 or $7 on Amazon after tax. And I was like, well, the poster looks like a bit of a throwback. And I like camp-based horror movies. I mean, Sleepaway is one of 3 Sleepaway Camp shirts that I own. I actually need to get more. I may rewatch Sleepaway Camp right after this, even though I just watched it last month, because I love that one. And I was like, all right, let's give it a shot. You have some, preteens or just around teens. You have some kids acting. You have some young adults as counselors. You have this overlaying story about, maybe a doctor that used to live on this land before they flattened it and turned it into a camp. So there, all the ingredients for what actually turns out to be one of the most surprising horror movies that I have seen in quite a while. I pretty much enjoyed quite a bit of this. It was almost a little too ambitious for its indie budget and its indie outlook and its indie setting, and that's not a knock. That's not a knock at all. I'm actually very intrigued to see what Daniel and Andy will do in their future projects, because if this is what Daniel did in his feature debut, what else is he going to be able to do if this gains enough traction? I encourage you guys to actually check this out. Now, is every single question answered? I mean, enough of them are. There are a couple loose ends. This actually kind of reminds me of We Summon the Darkness in the sense that, that one had a little more star power to it. I'm not knocking the cast here. But that one, more isolated horror, that kind of stuff, mainly taking place at one location. It did have Alexandra Daddario, who I just adore. And I have to say that Georgia actually does a really, really good job in this as one of the counselors. There's a guy named Franklin. There are various others in this. And there's also the little girl, Pilar, that Morgan ends up, having a bit of a crush on, as we've all had crushes at summer camp or when we're young and everything. And I do have to say the kid performances actually are pretty good overall. There's some nice pacing with the writing and everything. Even if things do start slow and things are a little typical, it really does ramp things up and actually ends up paying it off quite well, and even lays some groundwork for what we could possibly see from these guys in the future. And I'm encouraged to see what they're going to do, because this actually ended up being a lot of fun. There were some good horror elements, especially in the second half. and some nice story building. So I really did end up enjoying this. It's on Amazon for a few bucks if you want to check it out. But yeah, that's really all I have to say as far as positive stuff without getting into spoilers. Not perfect, but definitely a lot better than I expected. So 3, 2, 1, and spoilers. So in the beginning, of course, there was rap. Dr. Dre once said. And we see Morgan trying to play ball with some kids. They kind of don't want anything to do with him. Also, Morgan suffers from nightmares that involve drowning, involve water, like water bursting out of his gut and him drowning in his own goddamn room. And he lives at another place. His parents are there. His grandfather's there. And unfortunately, his grandfather gives him a bit of advice. You know, sometimes the best adventures are unplanned. That's kind of something that goes a little bit later with, what ends up being revealed. The grandfather, unfortunately, ends up suffering a heart issue. Now, it turns out that Morgan reveals later on that he almost drowned in a pool, and the grandfather was able to save him. He got tangled around one of those vacuum cleaner things that they have, like the thing in Paranormal Activity 2 that the ghost eventually took out, and then Katie Featherston showed up and snapped the neck, and boy, I wouldn't mind suffering that fate, and I don't have issues. Shut up. You have issues. Back to Marshmallow. It has the 80s feel to it from the camp, just the counselors and stuff like that, but it is modern age. And I like that about it because you can tell that they understood some subtlety with horror and everything, even as they had to reveal things later on, almost do an exposition dump in the third act. CJ is a bit of a bully kid. He is somebody that they indicated that Morgan hung out with one time, or interacted with one time. Why is he going to be part of this? And something about this camp totally feels off. There's a campfire doctor story about this doctor that ended up saving lives during the day. And he had a basement where he was doing all kinds of crazy experiments, all kinds of bullshit and everything. And his wife discovered that, and he sewed his wife and their 2 kids together. Color Out of Space style, I assume. At least I want to go with that. They couldn't show it, but that's another movie that was certainly ambitious and weird. It had Nicolas Cage and a Lovecraftian spin without the racism. Nevertheless, I did like how it was actually filmed in an actual camp. They didn't just build a set. They used that, which cut down on costs, and also, I believe, may have used some actual camp, or the camp staff may have really helped them out, and everything seemed like a community-themed horror movie. And gradually, they start seeing the doctor. They start seeing some weird stuff. Morgan ends up being picked on by CJ, but CJ also tends to have, maybe a few rage issues, like something's really not quite right about him. There's something about pink starburst that Pilar ends up giving him. And, just like they may go on a little bit of a reading date. Ooh, I'm just having a little bit of fun here. These kids did fine. But there's something about Cabin 16, because they keep kind of indicating that Cabin 16 isn't quite right. They're in this story about the campfire, the doctor. They indicate that the house and everything got leveled. Spoiler, it actually didn't, because these experiments never actually stopped, and I will get into that here in a bit. Franklin basically says at Almar, we don't give up on kids. And Franklin's like the really, really nice, overly nice counselor. Rachel is the workaholic, but also kind of, you can tell something's wrong. There's a guy named Kazmar that's the big buff dude, and a few other where, there's something a little bit off about these counselors, but everything seems okay, even if maybe they don't want to be around kids or doing it for a job. CJ then tries to apologize and takes him out to the dock, Morgan that is, and pushes him in the lake. And because he can't swim, we eventually see somebody try to rescue him. See, Morgan's having all these nightmares. This one friend, Raj, shows up, and CJ just punches the teetotal shit out of him. I mean, is hitting him a lot to where, I'm sorry, they let that go a little bit too long. He should have actually been legally brain dead with how much he was hitting him, not just in the mouth, but in the skull. I'm not saying the kid was weak, but as hard as he was hitting him, he really should have been brain dead. But nevertheless, we had that Kazmar guy. He saves Morgan. And so the doctor, or not the doctor, but it kind of spoiled things a little bit there. Doctor keeps appearing. Really, that is, like just in the shadows and in like, nightmares, or maybe he's really there. And the main guy named Hugh, the guy running this camp, gives him some cocoa and says, you gotta drink that cocoa, that's an order, but hey, we're gonna do a reset on CJ. We're gonna do a reset. I wonder what that reset is. Experiments, that's what they're doing. What kind of experiments exactly? He tells him, drink the cocoa, that's an order. And now, more nightmares. He's having a nightmare where he's sitting at a table, almost submerged underwater, dinner table with his grandfather, Roy. And he says, I get to see you now. That's what he said just before he died. I get to see you now. I wonder what the hell he means by that. So, they reset CJ, because we end up seeing that, somehow Morgan ends up stumbling upon this underground lab, where CJ is getting reset through bizarre experiments. And the doctor's there, and the doctor gets stabbed in the goddamn foot. And, yeah, the doctor then just, even though should be selling the goddamn foot injury, gets some shock sticks. But it's not just one doctor, it's multiple doctors, because, yeah, every camp counselor's in on it. Even Franklin. Even though Franklin tries to do the right thing, maybe he's turning over a new queef. I don't actually think that's how that phrase goes. Everybody's in on it. Why is everybody in on it? Well, more on that here in just a little bit. We have some kids gathered by the counselors so they can round them up and everything and have them be part of these bizarre, unholy experiments against, whatever deity you believe in. But meanwhile, we have Pilar. We have another one that looks just like her that stumbles around like she's sleepwalking and stuff like that. And, because, by the way, in the cast, there is May and Pilar, and they're played by twin sisters. Sisters, never were there such devoted sisters. But, and that's not something you only find out if you look in the cast, because it's kind of subtle with how it describes that. But one girl named Carolyn ends up trying to get away after these kids try to come up with the idea of either going to a boat. Morgan says he can't do it because he almost drowned, tells that story and whatever. And Carolyn ends up falling down a hill, getting a stick like jammed in her freaking leg. Brutal. Good gore effects there. And she's like, we should have taken the boat. Then she gets to the goddamn police car, and the police car takes her away. We find out in here in just a little bit where. It's back to the camp, because the police are in on it, because of course they are. And since everybody's in on this, Franklin basically, however, does have just a little bit of change of heart and tells them, hey, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to give you the code to the office, Hugh's office. I'm going to have you go there, make a phone call, do whatever you need to do, get the police here, do this stuff. But also, there's no way to make a call because there's just this pre-recorded message about rounding people up and protocol and all this stuff. Because it turns out, this camp isn't the only place where this stuff's going on. But what is the big twist of what is actually going on? Well, him and Pilar break into the file room. And then they see, well, DOB, I know what that is. What is DOD? That's date of death. CJ died in 2010. It is not 2010 when this film takes place. And I get to see you now as like something that Morgan keeps hearing. He keeps hearing this kind of stuff. He remembers that's what his grandfather said. And, well, it turns out they sedate the Coco and they do stuff to these kids. They do stuff to these kids to make them better. Because they're not dead. They're an amalgamation of the best parts because they're clones, robots, programs, whatever it is. They don't actually come out and say it. But it's basically like parts of Clonus Horror. E.E. Cummings did not write this, by the way. That's a deep cut for MST3K fans. But the camp basically is a way for them to be improved upon during the summer. Then they go back, and then when they get old, they don't age like normal kids because they're not actually human. And I was like, okay, I certainly didn't expect that. And it felt earned. It didn't feel like they suddenly hit you with it it felt like when you thought about it, you're like, that kind of actually makes sense the way. You see what I mean by it being a little too ambitious for an indie horror, though? And I'm not knocking one bit. I still enjoy this, and I may end up watching this again at some point because it'll stick in my head. But yeah, the camp has been doing this for a long time, basically, because it's a way to give parents what they want, because that way, if they lose a child, they can still have this child, but they can still have the perfect child. But there are issues. CJ's outburst from earlier, not the only one that's having the outburst. But before that, Franklin is talking to Pilar and talking to Morgan and says, here's what we can do. Hands him some cocoa. Obviously, the cocoa's sedated. You can go back to hanging out with your friends and that kind of stuff, or you can find out what happens next. Have your memory wiped clean the last 24 hours and find out what happens next. Or find out what happens next. Later, the next day, Morgan seems to be just fine. And Casimir actually did get hit in the head by who he called Doink because he couldn't write it, but it was actually Dirk. Doink, no Matt Bourne here, thank God. You know, Matt Bourne probably would have gone for 16. If you get it, you get it. But doesn't matter. Matt Bourne's dead, so that's really just irrelevant as to whether he can say anything. But we end up seeing Morgan's talking to his friends and says to Casimir, are you sure, the hiking accident, you sure it wasn't a boating accident? So maybe his memory wasn't wiped clean, but he's going to play ball. They're playing around, and suddenly a body's floating in the lake. What the hell's going on? Was that Pilar? Because it looked like her. And suddenly he was talking to, one of his bosses and saying, shit's fucked around all these campsites and everything. CJ's not the only one. They are getting more violent. They are learning. They are adapting. These experiments aren't working. And suddenly, a girl that looks like Pilar, could have been Pilar, could have been May, whatever, showed up with a knife. And Pilar, and then does this end scene. We cut right to goddamn credits there, and okay, bravo to you, Daniel and Andy, you did good. You impressed somebody that can be very, very harsh when it comes to judging new horror, and horror that puts a spin on stuff that I've seen before. It took turns I didn't expect. It's not perfect. There are a couple pacing issues perhaps, but it is certainly something that would line up right with about Dangerous Animals as being a very, very surprising effort. So, fuck it. For the ambition alone, I'm going to give it an A-. I had fun with this, so let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter, Letterboxd, Blue Sky handles in the description. I'm John Ritzland, and until we meet again, happy trails to you.